Most of us have had some influence in our lives from Confucius, but we probably don't recognize it. I left home when I was 14, studied to be a Roman Catholic priest. It didn't take, obviously. Went on later to so I studied first with the Franciscans, then with the Jesuits, and then did my continuing education in the South Pacific, learning about Pacific Rim cultures and studying mythologies and native cultures and cultural anthropology all over the world. This trip will bring me up to some 135 countries that I have lectured in around the world, and I'm very, very fortunate and especially glad to be here with you and being able to share some of this information. Part of my goal and why I do this, even though I'm not a priest, as they say, you can take the boy out of the seminary, but you can't take the seminary out of the boy. That's definitely the case with me. But one of the joys of my work is being able to connect all of these beautiful faiths and religions, because I don't care which time or place that you're from, the news from that place and that time is filled with war. It's filled with heartache. It's filled with people killing each other over faith. It's no different today than it was 2,000 years ago, than it was 3,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago. The story remains the same. The only thing that changes is the people, the place, and the time. Today, my goal is to help connect you, this beautiful philosophy of Confucius, to maybe teachings of Christianity, maybe some of the teachings of Judaism, other ancient philosophies and theologies. The goal is that in a world where most of us define and distinguish by differentiation, can we take the next 45 minutes to see how these messages are similar? Can we take this time to find how we are more alike than we are different? And that will be the backdrop for all of my lectures. Shall we get started? So who is Confucius? Chinese Jesus? Martial arts master? Was he a bitter old man who became a philosopher, as most philosophers are? Or was he a prophet? Was he all of them? Like many of the great figures in the cultural history of our world, what we know about Confucius is both more and at the same time less than the man who probably was. He's more in the sense that probably many quotes were attributed to him that weren't his, and yet because we only know about him through stories from followers written 300 years after his death, these stories are probably less than the man that he was, because they weren't able to cover his humanity and his struggles, and to give us a sense of understanding for why he wrote and thought the way he did. Confucius's legacy remains powerful and strong even today throughout all of China and Asia. But who was he? Believe it or not, his name wasn't even Confucius. So, not a great start. Confucius sounds, if you're listening, more like a Roman emperor, like Augustus, Claudius, Marcus Aurelius, Confucius, right? But the man we now call Confucius was actually known as Confucius. And Confucius was his family and first name. And first, in Chinese language, the last name is first and the given name is second. So the name Confucius is actually a Latinized combination of the surname Kong with an honorific suffix of master, which is Fuzi. So Kong Fuzi became Confucius. He was born in the town of Qiufu in the Lu province in 551 BCE, 551 years before Jesus, at a time called the Axial Age. How many of you are surprised that he was born some 2,500 years ago? How many of you don't know enough to be surprised? This period in history saw the emergence of many tremendous thought leaders. When we think back to this period, it blows the mind to consider how many great thinkers came out of this time. Not only Confucius, but Plato, Buddha, Zoroaster, the principal person behind Zoroastrianism, and the Hebrew prophets. 500 years before Christ, this was the time that the Pentateuch was being written, attributed to Moses, but the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures were being written down at this time. They were passed down through oral tradition, but literally in the 6th century BCE, these were being written down. So all of this tremendous thought is happening at this period in time in our human history called the Axial Age. And this was a time before China as we know it today. Confucius' hometown in Chufu is now a famous tourist destination for those who want to go and discover more about his life and his thought. During his time, like all prophets, he was not appreciated in his hometown and in his city. Time has remedied that oversight. For a long period of time, his thought was accepted and used for governance around China. So this place, the place of his birth, is now considered hallowed ground in China. Today, the Confucius Temple, Cemetery, and Family Mansion are UNESCO World Heritage Sites and popular pilgrimage destinations. The Temple of Confucius was built shortly after his death in 479 BCE and has evolved to become a 50-acre complex. One of the great ways to recognize how he is revered, and it's very subtle. For those of you who have been to China and Beijing and seen the imperial city, the Forbidden City, you know that the tiles on the roof are glazed in yellow, which was reserved only for their emperor. This is the only other building in China that also has the yellow tiles on the roof. They called him the uncrowned king. And again, for those of you who are drawing similarities, for those of you who are Christians, think about these comparisons and these similarities, that this is all relevant to the conversation and how they saw him at this time. His family was aristocratic, but much like St. Francis of Assisi, for those of you who know that story, he left home and decided to go out on his own to see the world. Now, St. Francis of Assisi left a wealthy family, but for Confucius's family, he actually fell on hard times. And so he took menial jobs as a young man to pay for his survival and education. He showed a zeal for learning and for academics at a very early age. He said to his disciples, at 15, I set my heart on learning. I don't know about you, but I have never heard another 15-year-old in all of human history say those words. He studied music, mathematics, the classics, history, and more. He was especially interested in the early years of the Zhao dynasty, 1046 to 256 BC. So keep in mind now, he was born during this dynasty, but he was really interested in the early period of this dynasty. He believed this time to be a golden age to be emulated. We are all approaching the age when we look back on life and talk about the golden years, right? When we were younger. This is the same here. There's no change. He looked back on his life and said, this is the period of time that we want to be. We look back at the men who fought for our country in World War II, for the United States and Britain, and we call this the greatest generation, right? In the same way, Confucius looked back on the previous generation and called them the generation to be emulated. This was a golden age. Confucius believed that education and reflection led to virtue, and that those who aspired to command others must cultivate discipline and authority in themselves. In other words, don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me how to lead. Show me. Live lives that are worthy of your calling. Live lives that demonstrate your moral authority. And when you lead, we will follow. He strove to rise through the government ranks, but he tended to offend others, as many men with purpose and vision do. He was offensive. He wanted people to believe and to see things the way he saw them. And so he used his job as a pulpit for good governance. He eventually was appointed to an influential post in the Ministry of Crime, but he fell far from favor by pushing his aggressive reform efforts. For years, he tried to re-enter public service to improve it from within, but he found far greater success as a teacher. Confucius broke with tradition in his belief that all human beings could benefit from education. He believed that virtue came from education. And so if you want to have a virtuous society, how can you have virtue with people who don't understand what it is, who are disconnected, whose only goal is to make money? You can't. And so at this time, the only people who received educations were the heads, the big families, the wealthy families, those who were destined for great posts. Not every person. Education was considered to be a waste for those people. And he changed this. He said, everyone is entitled to an education. And if we want to live in a society, a virtuous society, we must educate everyone in our society. We know this to be true even today. He espoused a lifelong learning for the sake of self, not for any other purpose, but for self-empowerment and self-knowledge and self-improvement. He attracted a wide circle of followers who knew him as Confucius, and those who recorded his words put them into a book called the Analects, which is a collection of his concepts. Confucius, much like Socrates and even Jesus, is known only through a collection of these sayings and anecdotes recorded by his followers. For those of you who understand Christian history, the first Gospels were written some 40 to 70 years after Jesus had died. Even the Acts of the Apostles were written some 25 years after Jesus had passed. So really no one who was alive had really known Jesus. They were talking about these stories that came from a source. In the same way, these stories from both Socrates and Confucius and even Jesus have been adapted, a story has been told, and even interpreted for us over time. Who Confucius was, we don't really know. How could we possibly? However, the legend of Confucius began to take shape about 300 years after his death. The Analects are the group of phrases, this wonderful book, if you get a chance to read it, that outlines the thoughts of Confucius. Does it represent the man? Perhaps. But it certainly represents his ideas and the way that people perceived him to be. So if we're going to learn about Confucius, it's best to start with the Analects. It records the greatest sayings of perhaps the greatest philosopher, or one of the greatest philosophers in human history, and certainly, according to Chinese history, the greatest philosopher of Chinese history. Curiously himself, even Confucius says, what I'm saying isn't anything new or revolutionary. So if you think that what I'm saying is unique, keep listening, because all that I'm doing is really telling you to reflect back on your history. He strongly contends that he is merely transmitting the thoughts of the ancients and to urge today's audience to look back at a different time, a golden age, where people were more virtuous, more heroic, and more cultivated than the people today. So the good news is that someday people will look back on us and think the same. Believe it or not, it doesn't get much better. It only seems to get worse. Every successive generation looks back on those who came before and says, if only we were more like them. So good news, congratulations. In other words, he says to people, don't take my word for it. Smarter men than me have said these things. Confucius was quite conservative in all of his statements. He says, in essence, don't innovate. Stay true to the old ways. Honor your father and mother. Remember your duties. Remember, these were the same times that the Ten Commandments were being written. Sound familiar, right? This way of thinking mirrors many of the teachings emerging from the Hebrew prophets during the same era. The Analects depicts Confucius as someone who transmits but does not innovate. And in this sense, for those of you who know a little bit about Islam, Muhammad is seen in the same way. Muhammad receives the message, this revelation from the angel Gabriel. And it's not Muhammad who was saying this message, because Muhammad is illiterate. He can't read or write. And he's receiving this beautiful message from the Archangel Gabriel. And we know automatically that this is a special message because the Archangel Gabriel gives us all great news. It was the birth of Jesus, John the Baptist. Wonderful messages came from the Archangel Gabriel. And now we have Muhammad receiving the same message. So Muhammad isn't the one who receives credit. All credit goes to Allah, to God, for giving this message. And in this sense, Confucius is doing the same. He's saying, don't give me credit for these thoughts. These thoughts come from a different time, from a different period, from men smarter and greater than I. What Confucius claimed to transmit was the Tao, the way of the sages of Zhao antiquity. In the Analects, he's seen as the guardian of these beautiful messages, and he wants to continue to spread them and preserve them for future generations. The Analects were categorized into 4 groups: theodicy, harmonious order, moral force, and self-cultivation. We'll talk briefly about each of these. Theodicy, fun word. What is a theodicy? For those of you who are familiar with apologetics, theodicy is a very interesting term that talks to us about how people understand God in a difficult time, in a difficult world. The word comes to us from theos, God, and dike, righteous. A theodicy is an argument, is an attempt to justify the existence of God in an evil world, based on 3 assumptions. God is all good and all powerful. We agree. The universe creation was made by God and exists in a contingent relationship to God. A theist agrees. Evil exists in the world. Why? And perhaps even more importantly, how? The theodicy explains that. And there are many theodicy arguments that help explain for those who don't believe in God, and they use this as a foundational argument. How could there be a God who is all-powerful and all-good, all-seeing, all-knowing, and how can we see children suffering? How can we see these horrendous natural events? If God controls all of these things, how is this possible? A theodicy attempts to explain and to make sense of what we can't possibly make sense of. Many understand Confucius as a humanist who didn't discuss the supernatural. It may be surprising for those of you who know a little bit about Confucius to even hear the term theodicy, particularly as a framework for understanding his theological arguments. But considering his time, this idea of theodicy, this idea of a theological background, was very inherent in the way that he grew up. It was inherent in his culture at this time. For the early Chinese, the 16th century, 1500 years BCE, the world was controlled by an all-powerful god, Shangdi. And Shangdi, there are prayers made to him. They found bones with prayers written to the great Shangdi. There were divination ceremonies that are still being done in temples today, the bones being cast on the floor to see and to divine your future. Compare this to the God Most High, El Elyon, from ancient Hebrew texts. Most of you who have studied the Hebrew scriptures understand that the first God was Yahweh. You might be surprised to learn that in the Ugaritic texts that come from Canaanite texts, that there was actually a God before Yahweh, that Yahweh was one of 70 tutelary sons, and that the father of Yahweh, the father of God, was El Elyon, and he separated mankind into 70 nations, and there were 70 sons, and so he gave each one of his sons tutelary power over those nations. And so one of those was Yahweh, and Yahweh was known as the God of metalworking, the God of metalsmith, and also the God of war at some point. And so there's argument that says El Elyon either separated all of these and Yahweh became the God for the tribe of Judah, who was a warring tribe, a small warring tribe. And so we can understand when we read the Hebrew scriptures why these scriptures in the earliest books of the Bible are very focused on smiting and damage and lordship over all of these things, that this is almost sounds like an angry God, a vengeful God, almost described this way. But another one of the arguments is that El Elyon actually took this God for himself, and now we know it as Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton. Today, it is pronounced Adonai or Elohim because it has been forbidden to use the word Yahweh since the 2nd or 3rd century BCE. Now, back to Confucius. As the Zhao culture emerged and triumphed over the Shang dynasty, so they had Shangdi, right? As now this new Zhao culture triumphed over them, they had the question, what do we do with this old god? We have this old god Shangdi, but their god was the sky god, the heaven god, Tian. And you'll see this throughout many of the places. Even when we were visiting the other day, the caves in the island, you probably saw the name Tien or Thien in Vietnamese. It's the same. It's the temple of heaven. This is where we see this again, Tien. We'll see this name throughout our travels. This is the new God, the God of heaven, the God of the sky. Each culture, as they took control, had to give justification. Why do we belong here? Well, there's an easy argument for each one of them to take. We were put here by God. So theistic justifications come to us as far back as the great pharaohs of Egypt, who said that they were the sons of the sun god, right? So we even look back and we see Ra, the great sun god, and then we see the sons underneath him. And what were their names? Well, if you look at the Egyptian name for sun, it's Moses. And so Ra, Moses, Ramesses, is the son of the sun god. Ramesses, right? And now when you take the Hebrew of that, the word Moses means he who is drawn from the water, right? Wonderful stories that connect us all right back to these people who say, in order for us to rule, we have to have the power of God on our side. And so the power of heaven was at their backs and on their side to give them divine rule. In the Analects, a new aspect of heaven emerges, discerning the will of Tian and reconciling it with his own moral compass becomes a struggle for Confucius. He says, if heaven is about to abandon this culture, those who die afterwards will not have a share in it. But if heaven has not yet abandoned this culture, what can the men of Guang do to me? In other words, if God is for us, who can be against? And then he says, heaven has abandoned me, heaven has abandoned me. And I'll compare this to Jesus crying out, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is a direct quotation from the Psalms as well. So again, we see here this struggle, this idea that he believed that he was doing the will of heaven, and yet struggling to understand why he felt so alone in doing it. Confucius seems to be about two minds of heaven. At times he is convinced that he enjoys the protection of heaven, and yet at other times he believes that all is against him and that all is to be lost. He often finds himself in the woes of existential despair, wondering if he's fallen out of favor with God or with heaven. What remains consistent is his understanding about the power of God in the universe. He believes that if there is a God, it is aligned with moral goodness. He believes that this God can't do anything without human agents to actualize its will. And he also understands the variable, unpredictable nature of mankind. So there is a good God. We are the ones who represent God, and we can't be trusted. Harmonious order is an important part of Confucius' understanding of how things should be. Confucius focused his teachings on three types of interlocking order: aesthetic order, moral order, and social order. You'll see that Confucius was focused on duty, on order, on the way things ought to be. And the instrument for effecting all of this is ritual propriety. You must follow the rituals. The rituals are there for us to learn from each other and to respect each other. He says, do not look at, do not listen to, do not speak of, do not do whatever is contrary to ritual propriety. Confucius underscores this importance when he says that really this is the blueprint for good manners, for taste, for civility, and for morality, is following what we all agree to. As we have an order, we must all agree to follow it together. This is the foundation for civilization, is it not? For Confucius, the paramount example of harmonious social order seems to be the word zhao, which is filial piety, of which Jing is the key quality: reverence. Reverence for one's father, reverence for one's parents. And how does he explain this? He says we can observe whether or not someone is a good son by this. Observe what a person has in mind to do when his father is alive, and then observe what he has in mind to do when his father is dead. If for 3 years he makes no changes to his father's ways, he can be said to be a good son. But if he doesn't, then he is not a good son. If he makes changes immediately. And he says also, one of his disciples, Zuyu, asked about filial piety, and he says, nowadays, for a person to be filial, this is 2,500 years ago, he's speaking back then. Nowadays, we think that filial piety is just giving your parents food, taking care of them in their old age. No, no, no. It's much more than that. Even dogs and horses are provided with food. If a person shows no reverence, where's the difference? Aren't we saying these same things even today? How little time has changed. If in serving your father and mother, you ought to dissuade them from doing wrong in the gentlest way. If you see your advice being ignored, you should not become disobedient, but you should remain reverent. You should not complain, even if you are distressed. He believed that when things and people and things are in their proper places, and here tradition is the measure of propriety, relations are smooth, operations are effortless, and the good is sought and done voluntarily. In the hierarchical political and social conception of Confucius and all of his Chinese contemporaries, what is below takes its cue from what is above. And we too learn this way. A moral ruler would diffuse morality to those under his sway. A moral parent will raise a moral child. One of my favorite quotes from Confucius, he said, for good governance, a prince should be a prince. A minister should minister. A father ought to be a father, and a son. When we do all of these things, when we know our roles, and when we do according to our roles, don't things go well for us? This is the belief of Confucius. Moral force. We'll be talking in the next lecture about the Tao Te Ching. This is one of the primary elements. The Te is the moral force behind the way. The last quotation from the Analects introduces a term most famously associated with Lao Tzu from the Tao Te Ching, moral force. Like Tian, or the idea of history, Te, or the moral force, has a long history of cultural and religious importance, extending way back into early Chinese history. It's perceived of as almost a magical quality. Think for a moment about someone who you believe has an almost magical quality, that when you see them on stage, that they have something about them that draws you to them. This is what they would describe as te, this moral force, that it's not just something that's attractive about the way they look, that they speak with authority. Charismatic leaders have this. For Confucius, this seems to be a source of effective magic, but stringently moral. It's about quality, virtue of the successful ruler. And he says, one who rules by moral force may be compared to the North Star. It occupies its place, and all the stars pay homage to it. Te is the virtue of the successful ruler, without which he could not rule at all. In other words, he is a ruler because of his moral force, and he remains a ruler for the same reason. Confucius' vision of order unites aesthetic concerns for harmony and symmetry with moral force and pursuit of social goals, a well-ordered family, a well-ordered state, a well-ordered world. We see again this focus on ordering, on duty and responsibility. Such an aesthetic, moral, and social program begins at home with the cultivation of the individual. This isn't the obligation of the state, he would say. This isn't the obligation of faith. This is the obligation of the home. And so self-cultivation begins at home. And he says that there are two types of persons that are opposed to one another. Not in terms of basic potential, because he believed that all men were created alike at birth, but in terms of their developed potential. And here now we see the foundations of a constitution. All men created equal, right? But where do we differentiate ourselves? It's in terms of potential. These are the junzi, the profound person, and the shoutum, the small person. The profound person understands what is moral. The small person understands what is profitable. Hence the importance of an education. The junzi is the person who always manifests the quality of humaneness in his person and displays the quality of righteousness in his actions. The moral force of the profound person is like the wind. This is such a beautiful analogy. The moral force of the profound person is like the wind. The moral force of the small person is like the grass. Let the wind blow over the grass, and it is sure to bend. Two passages from the Analects go a long way in indicating the path forward towards self-cultivation. And I urge you to think for yourselves in these same terms and ask if it isn't true. Think for yourself now. From the age of 15 on, I have been intent upon learning. From 30 on, I have established myself. From 40 on, I have not been confused. From 50 on, I have known the mandate of heaven. From 60 on, my ear has been attuned. From 70 on, I have followed my heart's desire without transgressing what is right. And if that isn't or hasn't been your path, might it be? What a beautiful way of speaking and living. The master's way is nothing but other regard, loyalty, and self-reflection. So our way is not in thinking for ourselves and doing for ourselves, but in being loyal to something that is greater than us. The conventional meaning of other regard, shang, in classical Chinese is loyalty, especially to a ruler. In the Analects, Confucius extends this meaning to giving oneself to the fullest in all relationships. Whatever you're going to do, be fully there. Self-reflection, or shu, is explained by Confucius as a negatively expressed version of the golden rule. So here we hear the golden rule expressed in a negative way. What you do not desire for yourself, you do not do to others. When one reflects upon oneself, one realizes the necessity of concern for others. And this comes to us even later in Buddhism, that we are all one. There's no difference between you and I. We are all one. From the Analects, Confucius emerges as a model of humility and honesty. At the very beginning of the Analects, he declares, to remain unsoured even though one's merits are unrecognized. Isn't this what's expected of a gentleman? He stresses that the value of knowing what one doesn't know and cultivating the ability to learn from anybody, no matter how humble or mean. He notes, even when walking with a party of two or more people, I can always be certain of learning from those I am with. There will be good qualities that I can select for imitation and bad ones that I will teach me what requires correction in myself. And here is the distinction. He doesn't seek to correct those who are wrong. He recognizes that he probably has this in himself and to choose first to correct what's wrong in himself. Confucius' spirit of humility is shared by Taoist thinkers Lao Tzu and Huangzi, whose texts pose the greatest challenge to Confucian thought. The typical pattern that emerged in Chinese society is that a person would be Confucian during one's working life and Taoist in one's later life, that he would work hard, live a simple life while you have to, and then later on to retire to the countryside and write poetry and drink wine. And isn't that true even today, all of you on this cruise? This is my favorite part. We get to talk a little bit about the proverbs and the teachings of Confucius. Confucian proverbs have the power to transform lives, but they are not for casual reading. Hear them once and feel their power. Consider them again and appreciate their depth. Remember them and learn from them, and you will be enlightened. Beauty. Everything has beauty, but not everyone sees it. A wonderful paradox. They must often change who would be constant in happiness and wisdom. What is life? Life is change. If we persist in remaining unchanged in the face of constant change, how can we be happy? Moreover, how can we be wise? If faced with the constancy of change, we must also change, because change implies growth. We cannot grow if we're not first changing. And so, in order to be happy, we must embrace change. In order to be constant in happiness and wisdom, we must change. So, change equals constancy in happiness and wisdom. Therein lies the paradox. Look within. What the superior man seeks is in himself. What the small man seeks is in others. Equality. In a country well governed, poverty is something to be ashamed of. In a country badly governed, wealth is something to be ashamed of. When anger rises, think of the consequences. Very simple. How often do we think of the consequences when we think of other arguments, right? But he says, take it down a notch. Think of the consequences to getting angry. Setting goals. This is one that we share with our children. When it's obvious that the goals cannot be reached, don't adjust the goals. Adjust the action steps. There's a way to reach that goal. You just have to think differently about it. Faced with what is right, to leave it undone shows a lack of courage. How many of us have heard this one? This is a Confucian phrase that most of us have probably heard. Before you embark on a journey of revenge, first dig 2 graves. Success depends upon previous preparation, and without such preparation, there is sure to be failure. Good habits. Men's natures are alike. It's their habits that carry them far apart. We're going to do a little experiment here. I'm going to read this, and then we're going to read it together. I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. Now close your eyes. Say it with me. I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. You'll remember that now. Respect yourself and others will respect you. That may or may not be true. But what I can tell you is that the converse is definitely true. If you don't respect yourself, others most surely will not respect you. Silence is a true friend who never betrays. If only we believed that more. Study the past if you would define the future. Powerful word. Study the past if you would define the future. If you seek to lead, if you seek to be an agent of change, know history. We hear this repeated throughout history. Live with purpose. Wheresoever you go, go with all your heart. I wish this for everyone. No matter where you are, to be fully in the moment. There is nothing in the past. It's already gone. The future is a figment of our imaginations. It doesn't exist. All that we have is right now. And so wherever you are, be there with everything that you have. Love with everything that you have. Give with everything that you have. And be all that you could possibly be in that moment. How beautiful this phrase is, and yet what we know is that most of us live the contrary. Forget injuries and never forget kindnesses, and yet most of us rarely remember kindnesses because they're overshadowed by the injuries. If only we could turn that on its head and forget injuries and remember kindness instead. Have no friends not equal to yourself. This is a great rule for governance as well. The greatest people in our world's history have been those who surrounded themselves with people who were equal or smarter than them, and this is how we get great leaders. Live simply. Life is really simple, but we insist on making it complicated. Tonight, 8 billion people will go to bed. Tomorrow morning, 8 billion people or less will wake up. And what we do in between is as simple. It's the same. We live, we eat, we sleep, we work, we love, we give, we cherish. Why make it more complicated than it already is? Isn't it beautiful enough? A superior man is modest in his speech, but exceeds in his actions. Again, don't judge me by how I speak, judge me by how I live. It's okay to make mistakes. This is important for us parents and grandchildren who've been perhaps raised differently, to share with our children and grandchildren that don't be ashamed of mistakes, because when you do, you make them crimes. Make your mistake, learn from it, move on. We are what we think we are. The more a man meditates upon good thoughts, the better will be his world and the world at large. Living frugally, he who does not economize will have to agonize. When we see men of a contrary character, we should turn inwards and examine ourselves. If we were looking at this in the gospel, we would say, instead of seeing the speck in your brother's eye, should you not first inspect the plank in your own? Do what you love, choose a job you love, and you will never have to work a day in your life, says Confucius, who probably didn't work many days in his life. It does not matter how slowly you go, as long as you do not stop. Persistence. And our greatest glory is not in never failing, but in rising every time we fall. Confucius has a tremendous legacy throughout Asia. We see it in the economics of Japan from the 1980s moving forward, and we see it now. It's apparent to us as we travel throughout Asia, and we see these incredible cities, advanced technology, this work ethic that is remarkable for many of us to see, and their economic success. But there are those who have had problems with Confucius and the intellectual movement of Confucianism inspired by his thought. Early communists saw the ideas of Confucius as particularly troublesome because they didn't promote social equality and justice by promoting hierarchies instead and obedience to elders and superiors. This was anathema to the early communists and to Chairman Mao. Another aspect of communism, of Confucianism, that drew criticism relates to the status of women, and that women in the Confucius model were to pass their allegiance from their father to their husband and to their son. And make no mistake, that was the intention during this period in time. How much misogyny there actually is in the Analects is a matter open to debate, but it's fair to say that Confucius and his contemporaries were interested in creating a society that was male-dominated. It's clear today that many contemporary proponents of Confucian values hold more progressive views on the role of women. I love this graphic because what we expect and what we almost see in our minds is someone carrying in position with a gun, and yet she's carrying a pen. This idea that the pen is mightier than the sword, than the gun. While the communists violently attacked Confucianism during the Cultural Revolution, his image has been rehabilitated over the years, and he is now considered a remarkable historic figure in Chinese literature and in Chinese faith and philosophy. Much of Asia's obsession with education as learning is traced directly back to the Analects. Confucius was largely ignored in his own day, and when he died in 479 BCE, he left behind perhaps 3,000 students who were learning the master's principles. They were enthusiastically adopted by the Chinese state, by the Han Dynasty in the second century, and they would go on to guide governments and individuals throughout Chinese history and civilization. An intellectual giant he most certainly was, but an ancient Chinese text actually recorded the height of Confucius as 9 feet 6 inches tall. While that document may, of course, have exaggerated his physical side, there's no doubt that Confucius was a teacher of tremendous stature and importance. And his ideals have become entwined intrinsically into the fabric of Chinese and Asian culture even today. And I can't leave this lecture without having some fun at the expense of Confucius. And hopefully you will have seen some of these. If not, I hope that you delight you as much as they have me. We've all heard the funny one-liners. So these one-liners have nothing to do with Confucius, but they're fun nonetheless. And it's like my father says, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Sharp tongue. He who has a sharp tongue cuts own throat. If something happens but nobody posted on Facebook, did it really happen? With great power comes great electricity bill. Man who does very little make very few mistakes. When called an idiot, sometimes it's better to be quiet than open the mouth and remove all doubt. That is my father's absolute favorite. I heard that more times growing up than I care to remember. I love this one because it's true. War does not determine who is right. War determines who is left. Important today more than ever. Man who has clear conscience usually have bad memory too. Men who open car door for girlfriend reveal one thing. Either car is new or girlfriend is new. And in closing, I leave you with one last nugget that is most definitely not from Confucius, but it's fun to talk about anyways. When man bring wife flowers for no reason, there's usually a reason. Thank you all for coming out and spending this time with me tonight. It's great seeing you. Thank you. Thank you.